divided forever. So likewise, my motion could be divided into infinitive parts. Huh? And even the time it takes me to walk down that is divisible forever. Huh? But the discrete is not divisible forever. Now, of course, this distinction between the discrete and continuous is even more basic to mathematics than to natural philosophy, because mathematics is about quantity. Huh? But arithmetic is about what? The named discrete quantity, which is number. And geometry is about what? Continuous quantities, the line and the angle and the plane and the surface, body and so on. Huh? So the distinction between arithmetic and geometry, both of which are found, by the way, in Euclid's Elements, is based on this distinction here between the discrete and the continuous. Huh? Okay. So sometimes they say how much or how many, right? There's that little difference there, huh? In the way we speak. Huh? So this is the second category. Huh? And notice, the most basic division of continuous is that which is continuous in one dimension, a line, then in two dimensions, the surface, and then in three, the body, right? And of course, we show later on in geometry that it can only be three dimensions. Only three lines that are each at right angles together, too. Well, it's kind of interesting if I contrast it a little bit with logic here. In the beginning of logic, we distinguish three acts, right? And there are three parts of logic corresponding to those three acts. Here we have three species of continuous, the line, the surface, and the body, but only what? Two parts to geometry. Plane geometry and what? Solid geometry, right? Kind of interesting, huh? Plane geometry is both about what? The line and the what? Geometrical figures, right? Okay. In the very first theorems, if you recall, in Euclid there, the very first theorem, right, is ordered to the second theorem, right? And so on. And eventually to cutting off a line equal to another line, right? But you have to use circles and figures, so you're already in a plane, right? So if you have some experience of the beginning of geometry there, you can kind of see why there's no geometry of the line distinct from the geometry of plane surfaces. But there is a distinction between plane geometry and solid geometry. Huh? And books 1 through 6 are really plane geometry, and books 11 through 13 are solid geometry. Huh? And he interrupts it with 7, 8, and 9 with the arithmetical books. And there's a reason for that, but we won't go into that right now. Okay. Yeah.
So you said our thoughts are discrete quantities, and that it is a sign.
That they're not quantities at all, but they're like numbers. You say, right?
Okay, but you said it was a sign that it's immaterial.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to understand, why is that?
Okay. Well, if you see the connection between the continuous and the body, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every body is continuous. Huh?
Yes.
So what is received in the body is received as continuous.
Mm-hmm.
But even when we receive the continuous into our mind, our reason, in the form of thoughts now, right? Mm-hmm. The thoughts are not continuous. So we receive the continuous in a non-continuous way. Why is that, huh? It's not because of what is received, because that's continuous. Therefore, it must be due to the nature of the receiver. Whatever is received according to the nature, the condition of the receiver. So it's a sign that the reason is not a body, that it knows bodies, the continuous, in a non-bodily way, a non-continuous way. Okay? And if you go back, say, to the definition, which we're going to be talking about, but mentioned a little bit already, the genus being one part and the difference being another part. Do the genus and the difference in a definition meet at a point, a line, surface? I don't know. If they met at a point, the definition would be a line. It's not a line. they met at a line, they'd be circus, but not circus. So we're getting ahead of ourselves by just mentioning, how the distinction here in logic, which Aristotle points out in the chapter on quantity and how much, this distinction between the discrete and the continuous. Every quantity has parts, right? And either the parts have a common boundary or they don't. That's the basis for the distinction between geometry and arithmetic. But it's also important later on in coming to understand that the reason, the universal reason, the ability for a large discourse, right, looking before and after, is not a body. It's Anaxagoras, who we'll meet when we do some natural philosophy, who first begin to suspect that the mind is not something material. But Plato, and especially Aristotle, brought this out much more fully. Okay. Aristotle gets to the chapter on quality, the chapter on how, or to use the more abstract word, quality. Here we have an example now of a division into four, by the master himself. And this is one of the prime examples I give why I don't think that one should always divide into two or three. Okay? I'm not a fanatic about that. But I think it's a good rule because it's true for the most part. Now, the first species of quality that Aristotle speaks of is called disposition or habit. A habit is in a way a disposition, but it's a disposition that is firm, right? And therefore it's got its own name, habit. Okay? And later on we divide habit into virtue and vice. Okay? Now the second species of quality is natural ability, or inability. Okay. And there we put the ability to digest, ability to see, ability for a large discourse, looking before and after. It's like a quality of man, right? A natural ability. The third one is the sense qualities. Fourth one is figure or shape. So Aristotle distinguishes then, or divides, the genus quality, which is one of the 10 highest genera, into these four. And if you ever look at the Summa Theologiae of Thomas in the Prima Secundae, we started to take up what we sometimes call moral theology. He wants to talk about virtues and vices and so on, right? But he recalls what Aristotle says about quality. And he sees that the virtues and the vices come under quality. But then he will recall this distinction of the four, right? And then show that virtue and vice come under this species, right? Okay. So you can see how the different highest genera are starting points for the different sciences, right? For the distinction between geometry and arithmetic, we sometimes go back to what Aristotle says about quantity. When Thomas wants to talk about virtues and vices, he goes back to this, right? Okay? As Aristotle himself does in the second book of the Nicomachean Ethics, when he wants to define virtue, right? passions come under this thing too. What we call feelings, right? Similarity there. Aristotle will ask, are the virtues a natural ability? Or are they a passion, a feeling, right? Or are they a habit or disposition, right? He's pretty sure they're not this thing over here. But which one of these is a virtue, right? Is anger a virtue or a vice? Or is the ability to feel anger a virtue or a vice? Or is it some kind of what? Habit or disposition, right? Where I'm disposed to feel anger when I should, or when I shouldn't, depending on whether it's a virtue or a vice, right? Eventually he's going to conclude that the genus of moral virtue, moral vice, is disposition or habit, right? Habit in particular. Okay? The same way for temperance and all these virtues. It's not the ability to be hungry that makes you tempered or intemperate, right? It's not hunger as such, right? But the fact that you're disposed, right, to desire these things moderately, reasonably, that you are virtuous, or because you're disposed to desire these things more than you should, that you maybe are intemperate, right? Okay. So Aristotle, in the chapter on quantity and quality, he gives the first division of the genus into its what? Species. Huh? And that helps us to understand the highest genera better, because we can't define them in the strict sense. Huh? Because the highest genus doesn't have any genus above it, right? And so there's no genus and differences whereby you can define it. Yeah. So the way you have to know it, by that which is divided, makes it more clear to us. Huh? But it's also a starting point for our investigating into things. Huh? If you're getting the genus, eventually, of virtue or vice, to the genus of reason, right? The other genera. Okay. Now, like substance, the basic division of towards something, huh? Aristotle doesn't make it explicit there, or in the physics he does. Towards something. Or sometimes we use the more abstract word there, relation. But we might mention a little bit about this. Relations are based upon something more fundamental. And some relations are based upon quantity. And others are based more upon acting upon and undergoing. And quantity, they sometimes distinguish there between quantity in the strict sense and then the one which is the beginning of quantity. Okay? So I'm taller than you, or I'm shorter than you, right? Or I'm equal, right? Okay? These are relations based upon what? Quantity, right? Huh? Okay? But I could be taller than one of you and shorter than somebody else, right? Huh? It's being towards another, right? Huh? Okay? But it presupposes my quantity, my size, right? And yours too, for that matter. Huh? Okay? In one, huh? Well, actually, equal should be over here. Because there, that's a kind of unity, right? Or we're alike, huh? Same, huh? Same, like, equal. Okay? But here we have double. greater, lesser than, right? Okay. Relations based more upon quantity. And then the other ones are based more upon qualities and the acting upon undergoing the result of that. So father and son, right? Huh? Okay. Mother and son. Huh? Teacher and student, right? Huh? Teacher's acting upon you. You're undergoing it, right? One friend of mine, Brother Richards, who teaches, describing, his classes there, where is he, at the University of Colorado somewhere, looks down upon the students looking up at him. The kind of expression in their face, why are you doing this to me? But the mover and the moved, right? Huh? Okay. So you have one group of relations that are based more on quantity, and the others upon acting upon undergoing in some way. Huh? Okay, that goes back to certain qualities, right? Okay. But notice, if I know something, that's a quality of me, right? Huh? Okay. But I have to in some way act upon you, right? Before I can be said to be your teacher, or you can be said to be my student, right? Huh? Okay. I can have muscles, right? Huh? But I have to actually move something before we have this relation of the mover and the moved. Huh? Okay. Now the last 6 categories, Aristotle just kind of enumerates them. Huh? Question?
Just about the thing under the relation based upon. Did you say that I was writing something else there about based upon quantity and quality?
Well, in a sense, they usually say acting upon undergoing, but those kind of presuppose certain qualities, right? Okay.
I think I've seen St. Thomas divide relations into act upon and undergoing, or based upon that and based upon measuring. It's the same thing as
Quantity, yeah. Now the remaining categories, we're not going to do that so much. But you kind of wonder, you have the category of where, and the category of when, right? And category of position or positioned. And then you have what I take the liberty of calling outfitted, but to have in the Greek or Latin. And then you have acting upon and undergoing. But I often wonder about where. We are said to be in this room, right? We are said to be in, what's the genus of that? Is it to be in Petersham? And the genus of that is to be in Massachusetts? Is that the genus? What would be the genus, huh? It seems to be more like whole and part almost than like, what?
genus and species.
Yeah, at least not genus and species in the same way you have in the first 4 there, right? Or to be, here today, right? To be here this week, to be here this month. It's kind of strange. If that's the genus, it's kind of strange, or a different sense almost to genus. To have a suit on, to have a tuxedo on, right? But this Aristotle doesn't even devote a chapter to those, he just enumerates them, exemplifies them, that's it. But he has a whole chapter devoted to substance and one to quantity, and one to quality, and one to relation. He takes us up again the words of the metaphysics. Might mention though, when he takes up the word how there in the metaphysics, he distinguishes 4 senses, but he eventually reduces them to 2. Back in the rule of 2 and 3, right? I'll give you that for another occasion. So, up to this point now, we've been introducing you a bit to the 2 fundamental works in logic, in the logic of names, you might say, which is the first part of the logic of the first act. One book called the Isagoge, right, which is by Porphyry. Huh? And I mentioned before how the word Isagoge is the Greek word etymologically the same as our word introduction, right? Agoge is like duxio, leading, and ice in, leading in. Okay? In Greek it'd be E-I-S, I guess. Okay. The isagoge. So it means the introduction. Now, originally, the occasion for Porphyry writing this work was somebody was having a hard time understanding the book called the what? Categories of Aristotle, right? And in the book called the Categories of Aristotle, we'll use words like genus, species, difference, as if everybody knows what these mean, right? And there are places elsewhere in Aristotle where he talks about the word genus and difference and gives some information about them. So it was originally written as an introduction to the categories. But then it got kind of contracted to what? Introduction, right? This happens down through history, right? If you look at Sir Isaac Newton's major work, it's called in Latin the what? Principia Mathematica, the mathematical principles, Naturalis Philosophiae, the mathematical principles of natural philosophy. But got referred to for centuries as the what? Principia, yeah. Okay? But as time went on, they began to see calling this just the introduction as a kind of example of what? That figure of speech, antonomasia, right? This is the introduction to logic, which in a way is a tool of the whole philosophy, and therefore in a way it's an introduction to the whole philosophy. So it is by antonomasia, the introduction, right? Okay. And they often refer to this as the book of the five names: genus, difference, species, property, accident, to use the Latin derived words like genus, diaphora, eidas, opium, idios, and then some biblicos, right? So they call it the book of the five names. Actually, the Greek, they often say the book of the five vocal sounds. Okay, genus, species, difference, property, accident. But as Porphyry says in the Poemium, that to know genus, difference, species, property, and accident is useful, my friend, not only to know the categories, right? But it's useful for understanding definition. And we saw that because among those five names, you have the name that begins a definition, the genus, right? And the name that completes a perfect definition, difference, right? And the name of what is being defined, namely species. And then the name of what is useful to investigate, the what? Difference if you don't know it, namely property, right? And which can be substituted for a kind of imperfect definition if you don't know the difference, right? And then the name that is useless for naming a thing or for defining it, right? So green is useless to name triangle and useless for defining triangle. Right? Okay? So he says it's useful not only for the categories, but also for definition. And he says it's useful for division. And you can see that because one of the main kinds of division in philosophy is the division of a genus into its what? Species. Like in Euclid, you have the division of quadrilateral into square, oblong, rhombus, rhomboid. You divide a genus into what? Species by differences, right? So it's useful not only for definition, but for what? Division, right? And then the fourth thing he says it's useful for, it's useful for demonstration, understanding demonstration. Now in a demonstration, you tend to prove a property of a species. You show, for example, that it's a property of the triangle to have its interior angles equal to right angles. And proposition, 32 of the book 1 of the elements, right? You prove a property of the species, and you show why that property belongs to that species. Now, as you know from your understanding of property, it's something that follows upon the nature of the species. So if you define the species and know its genus and difference, you would maybe be able to see why this property belongs to the species. The old example in the logic books is that risible is a property of man. And risible means this what?
Able to laugh.
Yeah. It's very ridiculous, we dare, to laugh. Okay? Now to define man as we do as an animal with reason, right? You can see why he's the animal that laughs. Right? Because he's an animal, he can make the sounds of laughter, right? But because he has reason, he can see something laughable, something absurd, something ridiculous, right? Something preposterous, right? Okay. And so, in a way, the conclusion of a demonstration is stating the property of the species, right? Man is risible, right? And the middle term uniting those two is the definition of man, which includes the genus and the difference of man. So species and property and genus and difference are necessary for understanding what? Demonstration, right? And this will be the highest kind of reasoning, aquinas in Greek, right? Demonstration is called in Latin. That's why Euclid, you'll see at the end of the demonstration, they'll have the Latin initials there, QED, right? What was to be demonstrated. We've done it. I'm from Missouri, better show it to me. The word apodixis in Greek and demonstrare in Latin from the word to show, right? I showed it to you now, right? It's clear. Well, that's really a magnificent, absolutely magnificent framing he has to his own work. He says to the friend who asked him to write a book, explaining what these words that Aristotle is using in the categories, genus, species, difference, and so on, property. He says it's useful not only for what you asked me for, right? But it's useful for understanding definition, for understanding division, for understanding demonstration, right? And there's a text in Thomas, I forget where it is, but kind of a summary of the scientific method. He says in 3 words, definiendo, dividendo, demonstrando. 3 Ds there, a nice alliteration. Defining, dividing, demonstrating. Just like Euclid, right? He defines these things like triangle. He divides them into their species like equilateral, scalene, isosceles. And then he starts demonstrating properties, right? Defining, dividing, demonstrating, right? So this is what this is useful for. Defining, dividing, demonstrating. And for understanding the categories. Okay. Now, in Latin, those 5 were sometimes called the predicabilia. Predicabilia. Okay. And so in English, we call them sometimes the 5 predicables, able to be said of, right? In Latin, they used a similar word to describe the 10 categories. They called them predicamenta. To use the plural, predicamentum. And you see that's where you get the word predicament. And they kind of used to enjoy the fact that when someone says, I'm in a predicament, right? The situation is hard to get out of. I'm in a real predicament, you know, can you help me out? And that's kind of a reflection of the 10 predicates, right? Because you can't get out of there, right? If you're a quality, you know, if you're a habit, you can never be a substance or a quantity, right? If you're a number, you're always going to be a quantity. You're stuck there. The rest of your being, right? And so it's kind of funny here. It seems like the abstract word has come into daily speech, though, huh? And so you see this in literature and so on. Guys in predicament. Actually, the Greek word, though, categories, comes from the courthouse. Huh? If you see this work of Plato called the Apologia, the Apology. Categoria was the name for accusation, legal accusation, right? Charging you with some crime, right? And apologia is the name for the defense in the what? Courtroom, right? So it's not apology as they transliterate it, right? No, it's a legal defense. Cardinal Newman wrote that work kind of defense of his life, as even the Anglicans, is apologia, right? Pro vita sua, right? A defense in a sense. Huh? But Socrates, in a way, in the apologia, in the apology, as we call it in English, is defending himself in court, right? Not only against the charge, he's defending his whole life, right? As a philosopher. But categoria was the opposite of apologia. That's the accusation, right? And the reason why the word is borrowed was that when I accuse you, I have to accuse you of something. Huh? You're a murderer, or you're a thief, or you're an embezzler. I got to say something of you, right? And the categories is what? The 10 ways something can be said of individual substances, right? The highest. The 10 needs, right? So a friend of mine kind of playing on the legal origin of it, he calls them the 10 supreme accusations. Huh? What's supreme mean? The highest, right? The accusation is the 10 highest things I can say about you. The 10 supreme accusations. They did come in from the court, right? Huh? You'll find, you see, that the words that we use in looking philosophy are often borrowed from practical things. Huh? Just like the scientist borrows the word law, right? The word law comes from the human society at first. So though the biologist and the chemist and the physicist talks about the laws of nature, we don't call them lawyers, do we? Nor do we see them in the legal profession, right? Although they're all talking about laws.
So that Latin predicamento?
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah. Probably predicamenta, huh?
As opposed to predicable.
Yeah, now, again, it's. I think the names here are a bit like the names for the figures of speech. It has something to do with the meaning of it, but they don't really, I don't think, bring out the distinction of the two, right? They're both taken from the word to be set up, predicare, right? Predicable means literally able to be set up, right? But that's true about these things, you're able to be set of something. And predicamentum maybe has more the sense of actually set up, but it doesn't really bring out the distinction between the two. I'm just familiarizing you with the way they were named in Latin. Huh? So if you look at Albert the Great's paraphrase of the doctrine of these two works, in Latin one will be called De Predicables, huh? And that's about genus, difference, species, property, accident. And then De Predicamentis, huh? De being about. De Predicamentis, and that's about substance, quantity, quality, and the rest. Okay. Now, they would often refer to the categories as the book of the 10 names. Substance, quantity, quality, relation, where, when, and so on. Okay. So the 5 and the 10 names, right? Okay. I notice a difference between the 5 and the 10 names. The 5 names are names of names. And the 10 names are names of what? Yeah. Interesting, huh?
What was that? The 10 or what? Names?
Yeah, substance, quantity, quality, etc. The 10 names, the 10 categories, are names of things, right?
Things. Okay.
Yeah. So I am the substance, right? I am a what? My health, right? Is a disposition. It's a quality, right? Okay. My size is a quantity, right? My being a father or a teacher or a son, right? Or being taller or shorter than somebody. This is being towards something. By being in this room, right? These are all real. Huh? But the isagoge is about the names of what? Names, right? Okay. And sometimes you find in the Greek philosophers, and occasionally in Thomas, you have more in the sentences than the later works, but they'll speak of the first placing of names and the second placing of names. And they'll say the categories is about the first placing of names. Okay? What does that mean? Huh? Well, the simplest way of understanding it is that in the beginning there are no names at all, right? Remember how God made the animals by Adam and gave all names, right? I always call my wife that, but therefore the father should name the child, right? His name shall be John, right? But there's a bad factor, right? Anyway. Sometimes these things fall on deaf ears. So. Okay. But no, in the beginning, there were things, but no names, right? And for many practical reasons, as well as later on theoretical reasons, we're going to put a name upon these things, right? So a place upon this animal, dog, right? And upon this animal, cat, and upon this plant, tree, and so on. We place names upon things, right? And now we have not only things, but we also have names, right? And then we can come back and place what?
Names on names.
Yeah, and that's the second placing of names. Okay. Kind of a very concrete way of speaking, right? Huh? Now, for the goodness of teaching about names, we could attach a couple of things to what we've taken up here. One would be to talk about name equivocal, by reason. Which could also, if you want to, you can say it equivocally of things. Now, when he first distinguished genus, species, difference, property, and accident, these were 5 names, right? Said univocally of many what? Things, right? Names said with one meaning of many things, right? It's also possible to have what? A name said of many things with different meanings in mind. Okay? Like in my mother's saying there, I see, said the blind man, but he couldn't see at all, right? Now sometimes 2 things have the same name by chance, right? Okay? And then we call them purely equivocal, or equivocal by chance, right? But sometimes a name is equivocal by reason. Huh? And these names are very important in philosophy. Huh? Okay. And the most common names, the names that are used everywhere, and also the names that are used in the axioms, right? And the names that are used especially in wisdom, because it's about what is said of all. Those most common names are especially equivocal by reason. Huh? Okay. So, we could, as the goodness of the teaching there, add a consideration here of name equivocal by reason. Huh? The other thing we might add is a little discussion of figurative naming, right? Okay? Figures of speech, right? Figurative name. Huh? We'll call it figures of speech. Huh? Now, it's very hard to get a universal understanding of these figurative names. Huh? When I asked Monsignor Dion once, he referred me to Quintilian, right? Huh? Because Quintilian has a somewhat lengthy discussion of these things, but it's imperfect, I think, in many ways, as Monsignor himself would agree when I talked to him about it, right? Okay. think that what you should do with figurative names is to get a understanding of the most common ones. Huh? Okay? And I think they are 5 in number, right? The most common ones. And some of them have a name, and some of them don't. Some of them, the name has a name. Sometimes the way of naming has a name, right? Sometimes they have both, right? Okay. Give an example of what I mean here. A metaphorical naming, right? That's one way of naming things figuratively. You can also name things by irony. Okay? But a name used metaphorically has a name. We call it a metaphor. Okay? To my knowledge, a name used ironically doesn't have a name. Do you know a name for it? I don't. See. We've spoken here, a lot about antonomasia, right? Antonomasia, I think, is naming a way of naming things, right? But what do you call something a name that's used in that way? See, I don't think antonym means that. It has a different meaning if you look at the dictionary, right? So I don't think that what is named by antonomasia has a name, that kind of a name. There are many things you'll find out don't have names. Okay? I remember in class one day we were talking about what's the name for the desire for food? And they all said hunger, right? And what's the name for desire for drink? I said thirst, right? And desire to know, wonder, right? And what's the name of sexual desire? Then we have a name. You'll say lust, that's not really the name for it. It doesn't have a name. It says something that's well known and talked about. It doesn't have a name. Doesn't seem to, huh? Usually, Aristotle says things that don't come into our experience don't have names, right? They're rare in our experience. Here's something that's very common. Huh? But even equilateral triangle doesn't seem to have a name, does it? See? Square has a name. See? But equilateral triangle doesn't have a name. Okay. So, now what's common to all figurative naming, or figurative speech, is that the meaning of the word is not the meaning of the speaker. That's the best way to look at it, huh? The meaning of the speaker is not the meaning of the word, huh? Okay. And if the meaning of the speaker became a meaning of the word, it would no longer be what? Yeah. Now sometimes the dictionary is misleading in this way, right? Because if you look at the word pig in the dictionary, right, they might give as a meaning of pig, what? Glutton, right? But if that became a meaning of the word pig, then to call you a pig would be to call you a glutton. It would not be figurative speech anymore. Okay? So sometimes the metaphor becomes like pig is so common that people, almost want to call that a meaning of the word, right? And there may be, historically some words, some things that were named, metaphorically or in some other figure of speech, right? And they didn't have any name themselves, right? So that became their name, right? But then it's going to function as the thing's own name and not as a, metaphor, right? Okay? Let's see what Duane used to point out a little rule that Boethius gives, right? When he's opposed to when a name is being named equivocally by reason, and when it's being named figuratively. But here, it doesn't really, in many cases, have a name of its own, right? Okay. Here, it already has its own name, but you don't use its own name, right? Okay. You use the name of another thing, right? Okay. Now, I think the 5 most important kinds of figurative naming are, I'm going to give this in order here now, synecdoche, which seems to name the name itself, antonomasia. You put those two together because they're going to have something in common, as we'll see. And then you have the metonym and metonymy, which is the name of the way of naming. Now, synecdoche and antonomasia, I don't think there is, as I said, a name of the name, right? But a name of the way of naming, right? Okay? So maybe I make that a little more clear here if I can. Let me make a little chart here and put the name and the way of naming, right? The way of naming, we're talking about figurative naming here. Okay? So metonymy is one way of naming things figuratively, right? And when a name is used in this way, it's called a metonym. Okay? Antonomasia is another way of naming things figuratively. And you'll find in a big dictionary that word antonomasia, in a small dictionary. But I don't know myself of a name used in this way. Okay? Synecdoche, I think, is more the name of the name, okay, than the way of naming. Then you have the metaphor. You can speak of metaphorical naming and use a phrase like that. And then you have irony. Okay? These five, I think, are the most common. And maybe I'll leave a little text here where I talk about these five and give you a few, ad hoc references in Thomas. But you'll find Thomas very often referring to one of these five, right? Okay. There's a text, as I mentioned, in one of the epistles of St. Paul, where St. Paul uses irony in his letter, right? And Thomas wants to explain that St. Paul is not saying anything false. Although he's using irony, right? He's praising them when actually it's reverse, right? Yeah.
Slight aside. Did you not go into this somewhat in your foreword to the Bible?
Maybe did, yeah. Did I distinguish these five then, or not?
Not so much.
Yeah. But that's a very interesting text. I think that it's in that thing I'm going to leave you with. But Thomas explains that when a man speaks figuratively, right, the meaning of his words is not the meaning of the speaker, right? But an intelligent listener will gather the meaning of the speaker through what? The words, right? Okay. And he contrasts irony and metaphor there in that bigger text. Okay. So we'll come down to what they are. Now, synecdoche and antonomasia. In these cases, the relation of the two is that of what? Part and whole, right? Okay. But in the case of synecdoche, it's a composed whole in its part. A composed whole and its part. In the case of antonomasia, it's the general and the particular. And therefore the universal whole in its part. Okay? Now the composed whole is the first meaning of whole and part. The composed whole is a whole, as the word composed means, put together from its parts, right? Okay? And they sometimes call it integral whole, right? So if you give the name of a composed whole to one of its parts, or vice versa, that's an example of what? Synecdoche. Now if you give the name of the general to the particular, or the name of the particular to the general, this is an example of antonomasia. Okay? Now, as you can see in the English word particular, it comes in the word part, right? So it's like a part, but it's a secondary meaning of the word apart. The Greek word for general comes from the Greek word for whole, right? So they call this universe a whole. Okay? Now, give an example of synecdoche, right? Well, the one that everybody talks about in the Gospel of St. John is, and the Word was made what? Flesh. Okay? What does that mean?
Made man.
Yeah, it was made man, yeah. Now sometimes in Scripture man is called flesh, all flesh must come to thee, right? Sometimes man is called soul in Scripture. Okay? Well, then you're giving the name of the part to a whole, right? Now one of the heresies you have in the early church is those who say that Christ didn't have a human soul, and the place of human soul was the Word. Well, they're taking it as being said non-figuratively, but as being said in the form of a what? Synecdoche, right? Okay. But no, synecdoche is a very common thing in real life, huh? Daily life, huh? You know, he's a brain, huh? Okay. If a part of the man stands out for some reason, right? He's so smart, right? He's a brain. Is he a brain? No. You're giving the name of a part to the what? Whole. A part that composes the whole, right? Or suppose call them muscles, hiding muscles. Because somehow his muscles stand out, right? You don't challenge them, right? Okay. Or sometimes, there's a guy who comes in, at the time when they've got to kick a field goal or kick the extra point, and he never misses, right? And you call him the toe, right? You ever call that sometimes in sports, right? Because some of that stands out, right? Or some of these great wine connoisseurs, they can sniff a wine and tell you not only what grape it is, but what country it came from and what county, and, they're really good at this, right? So you might call him the nose, right? The nose, right? Okay. So those are all examples of synecdoche. You'll find them very often in daily life, right? Okay. In a way, Aristotle, when he says, reason more than anything else is man. That's a synecdoche, huh? Okay. Now, we're apt to name the whole from the part, but if you name the part from the whole, right, that would still be the same figure of speech. Huh? Now, in tonomasia, we often do both. Huh? We give the name of the general to the particular, and vice versa, right? Okay. And so, almost in several of the epistles of St. Paul and many other places, Thomas will explain how the word Christ is said what? Antonomasia, right? Christ means what? Anointed, right? But we use Christ meaning what? One man in particular, right? Huh? Okay? Because among all those who are anointed, all the kings and priests and prophets that were anointed in the Old Testament, for example, he stands out, right? He's anointed with the Holy Spirit, right? Huh? Okay? So, that's an example of antonomasia, or the Bible in English. Bible means what? Book, yeah. So say this is the Bible. We're saying we're using the general name for one particular book because among all books this stands out because it is the Word of God. Okay. But if a student is chasing girls and amorous, we might call him a what? A Don Juan or a Romeo, right? Or a Casanova or something, right? And then we're transferring, in a sense, the name of a particular but famous lover, right? Romeo or Casanova or Don Juan, and we're using that instead of the general name, right? Okay. So he's not Romeo, he's a lover. That's what he is. So to call him a lover would be to use non-figurative language, right? That's what he's a lover, right? But it's more colorful to say he's a Romeo, right? Okay. Or someone who's hesitant and and slow to act, they call Hamlet sometimes, right? Okay, so they may take somebody famous in history like Casanova, or some fictional character like Romeo, right? But someone who stands out, right? So this again is again common. Huh? When I was back in early 50s there, and I was just interested in politics, I used to call Senator Taft Mr. Republican, right? And so when Dirksen nominated him at the 50th convention, he says, I give you what? Mr. Integrity, Mr. Republican, my friend Bob Taft, right? Okay. But he's called Bob Taft, that's non-figurative, right? But Mr. Republican is kind of what? Well, there's all kinds of Republicans, all conventional Republicans, presumably, right? But he is Mr. Republican, right? Okay. And sometimes you see it, Mr. Baseball or Mr. something, right? You see? Antonio Messia. So it is a very common thing. Huh? One thing that's kind of interesting when you look at the epistles and so on in the New Testament, it's just Peter and Paul who are called apostles. And so they're called the apostles by Antonio Messia. A lot of times they see John Paul II refers to Peter and Paul as the princes of the apostles, right? Okay. But sometimes they're called simply the apostles. Huh? So Thomas Aquinas often refers to Aristotle as the philosopher, right? And he refers to St. Paul as the apostle, yeah. Instead of saying Paul, you say the apostle. Kind of capital A, right? Okay. He's the apostle of the Gentiles, right? So that's very common. So I put those two together, they're different, but they're both involve whole and part, right? But one the integral whole, or composed whole, and the other the universal whole, that's a part. Do you see that? Okay. That's very close, because you're naming a whole from its part, or vice versa, right? Now in metonymy, you have one thing is something of the other. It's not a whole or a part compared to, right? But it's something of the other, right? Okay. And there seems to be, I don't know, at least 3 or 4 examples of metonymy. Sometimes, a very common one that Thomas refers to is when you transfer the name of the container to the contained, or vice versa. So you've got the container and the contained. If you say, this is a holy place, or this is a wicked place, Thomas says, well, the place is not wicked, but the people in the place are wicked, right? But now you transit from the contained to the what? Container, right? Okay. Or you call this an unhappy age. Was the age, the time unhappy? No. But the people or the events are unfortunate. Okay. Another way, sometimes the name of the cause or the effect when it's transferred to the other. Okay. Shakespeare often sometimes he'll signify the cause by a noun, and the effect he'll use an adjective, or vice versa. He'll have the effect named by a noun and its cause by a what? Adjective, right? Okay. So you might speak of scornful pride. Okay. Well, scorn is really the what? Effect of pride, right? It's not pride itself, right? Okay. Disgraceful action, right? Okay. The action leads to disgrace, right? Okay. So, you find this in Scripture. Sometimes it says, "Let the earth praise the Lord." Somebody take that as being what? Metonym, right? It's not the earth is going to praise the Lord, but those who are what? On the earth, right? Huh? Okay. Now, in the case of metaphor and irony, you have something where one is not a part of the other, or something of the other, right? But there's a likeness or a what? Opposite, right? Okay? And so, when the husband or the lover calls his beloved honey, right? That's an example of a what? Metaphor, right? Okay? And even sweet is an example of a metaphor, right? Okay? The metaphor is based upon some kind of what? Likeness, huh? Okay? Again, this is very common, right? When I say you're a pig because you eat too much, right? Okay? Or you're a rat because you did something. It's agreeable, right? Huh? Okay? These are examples of metaphor. They're very common, huh? To express our emotion. Huh? Thomas, in the commentary of the Psalms, huh? He has the fullest explanation of the metaphor sweet that I have ever seen. And if you explain the text there, taste and see how sweet is the Lord, right? And so, he says three things about the sweet, right? One is that the sweet is pleasant, right? Okay, pleasing. A second thing he says about the sweet is that it calms us, right? Okay. Now you can see that, how when the police in the old days, that was a common thing. They find a kid and he's lost, right? He's crying and bawling, right? And they got to find the parents. Now you stop the kids from crying and bawling. Maybe buy them an ice cream cone or something, right? See? Or if you're driving across country with little kids in the car, it's good to have a little bit of candy in them, right? When they get too restless, you pass back some candy and then they're quiet, for a while, see? Okay? And the third thing about the sweet is it kind of is refreshing, right? That's why you have candy in the factories and so on, right? People going down the machine getting a candy bar so you can keep going, right? Huh? So he says the sweet then is pleasing, right? Restful, right? And what? Refreshing, right? So these things then are seeming God, right? Huh? Okay. So the beautiful is called sweet sometimes, huh? Shakespeare, instead of saying your beautiful form, he says your sweet form, right? Okay. It's pleasing to the eyes, right? It's a sight for our eyes, as we say. It's refreshing, right? Huh? And notice how we often describe the beautiful as what? Restful, don't we, right? And if you go to some place, there's a beautiful scenery. It's just so restful, Mm-hmm. Don't you see that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's pleasing, restful, and refreshing. I used to study in this little room there in the College of St. Thomas Library, right? And you had this big famous painting on the wall there, and I sit there reading my book, and then I look up, And your eyes get kind of tired reading, and you get kind of tired. Kind of pleasing to look at this big painting in front of me, Kind of restful, right? Kind of refreshes you, and you can go back, right? So metaphor is based on likeness. Irony is based on what? The opposite, right? So if you're mean to me, and you know in a way you're being mean to me, and I say, gee, you're nice. The example I always give to students is I come in on the weekend and you're under the table there drunk, and I say, what a fine example of an Assumption College student. But everybody knows that I don't mean what my words mean, right? Okay? I mean the what? Opposite, right? So in the case of irony, I mean the opposite of what my words mean. In the case of metaphor, I mean something like what my words mean, but it's not the same thing. Okay? In the case of metonymy, that's a little more obscure exactly how many cases are. But the most common examples I find in Thomas is for container or contain. One is translated to the other, right? And then he speaks maybe of cause and effect, one instead of the other. But in synecdoche and antonomasia, it's relation of whole and part, but the two kinds of whole, composed whole, universal whole, right? I think those are the most common kinds. Something like hyperbole, you find references to hyperbole, where someone says, I told you 1,000,000 times not to leave your such and such. And everybody knows that, you haven't told the person 1,000,000 times, right? That's obviously a figure of speech, right? But is it one different from all of these? Maybe it is. It's something like just a metaphor because you've told them many times, right? And you're taking, a large number, right? But obviously, maybe it's got a little different basis for it, right? I'll murder you if you do that again, right? Well, you don't really mean that, but we're trying to, make it very emphatic, But these 5 are the ones you meet the most, I think. I find, antonomasia and metaphor most of all in Scripture, but you find in synecdoche a lot, and sometimes metonymy, right? And sometimes arguments. They say Thomas is defending, Paul from this idea of saying something false, right? And to speak ironically is not to speak falsely, right? Socrates uses irony there in the Apology, right? He proposes as a reward that he be pensioned off, right? I mean, it's a punishment, right? That he be pensioned off, right? Everybody knows he's proposing a reward rather than a punishment, huh? So I'll leave this little text here, okay? It's not that finished, but okay. It's got some of these texts here. And spend a little bit the word figure of speech and so on. Okay, give that text that you're asking for us right there.
Okay.
The Corinthians, yeah. Okay. Now, as I say, to talk about the figures of speech is really more proper to rhetoric and to the poetic art, right? Because they want to use these primarily. Huh? The poet most of all, right? And for him, his great glory is in his metaphors and that stuff. But in rhetoric, we use metaphors sometimes too, right? Okay. So Nixon said the Democratic programs are retreads, right? New deal. And Pericles said that the young men killed in battle, it's as if spring had been taken out of the year, right? So that's a famous metaphor. So, okay, let's go back now to the other topic here. Footnote, very important. In the idea of name equivocal by reason. Now, if you say that a name is univocal, it would mean that it had only one meaning, right? If you say that a name is equivocal, you mean it has what? More than one meaning, right? And then we distinguish between a name equivocal by reason and a name equivocal by chance. Huh? Now, sometimes they call a name equivocal by chance, purely equivocal, right? And sometimes you see name equivocal by reason called analogous name, right? Okay. But I prefer to call it name equivocal by reason because analogous comes from the Greek word for proportion, right? And that's only one way of naming things equivocally by reason, to name them by proportion, right? So, this here, I think, is a little better way of stating it. And don't confuse the idea of a name being equivocal with a name being said equivocally of many things. Huh? It's possible that if a name is equivocal, you might say it of many things having only one meaning in mind. Take the word bat. Huh? The word bat is equivocal by chance. Huh? It can mean the piece of wood used in baseball, right? Or it can mean the flying mouse, right? Okay. But if I said the word bat of 3 baseball bats, it would be said what? Univocally, right? It's being said of the 3 baseball bats with one meaning in mind, right? So even though the word does in fact have many meanings, right? In saying it of these 3 baseball bats, it's being said univocally, right? But if I say it of the baseball bat and the flying mouse, it's being said according to different meanings that it has. Okay? So we're going to talk about name equivocal by reason. A name that has many meanings, but there's some what? Reason for it having these many meanings. Huh? There's a connection among the meanings. Huh? Okay? I don't think there's any one text in Thomas Aquinas or in Aristotle where they lay it out as universal as I'm going to try to lay it out now. Okay? So what I'm saying is kind of my thinking about this, the putting together, scattered text, right? Huh? Okay. You often see, how Aristotle and Thomas, they don't make all the distinctions that we made about something. They often make the distinctions that are relevant to what they're going to do here and now, right? Okay. But sometimes you find some place where they lay out the whole thing in a very universal way, right? But sometimes you don't. Okay? Just like I was mentioning before when we talked about the distinction of the roads in our knowledge, right? Pretty much Indiana who brought that together, right? Okay? Which is not to say that Aristotle and Thomas can see it, we just don't have one text, right? Where they lay it all out. Huh? Okay? So, to the best of my knowledge now, I think a name becomes equivocal by reason in 2 ways. And both of these ways we're going to subdivide. Huh? Okay? And let's take the simplest case, just where you have a name said of 2 things equivocally by reason, right? Okay? To simplify the examples. Huh? Okay? Now, one way, which is, as we'll see, less equivocal than the other, is, we'll just take the example of 2 things. Sometimes a name that is said of 2 things is kept by one of them as its own name, and the other gets a new name. Okay? So, let's add what I'm doing here. A name becomes equivocal by reason in 2 ways. Huh? One is by being kept as its own name by one of 2 things of which it is said. While the other gets a new name as its own. Sometimes a name that is said of 2 things, right, is kept by one of these as its own name, and then the other one gets its what? A new name as its own name. Huh? there's two ways that this happens. Huh? Before we go into those, I want to divide this considerably. The other way a name becomes equivocal by reason is by being carried over from one thing to another. Okay? By being carried over from one thing to another. Okay? Sometimes the name has been placed upon one thing, and then we see a reason to carry it over and place it in something else, changing, somehow the meaning, but having some connection with the original meaning. Now, the first, it seems to me, takes place in two ways. Sometimes, sometimes a common name is all that one of the two things has, while the other has something special about it, something that makes it stand out, right, in some way. Or it has something noteworthy in addition to what the common name sets up. And so it gets the new what? Name. I take the most familiar example of that. How many fingers do I have here in this hand?
5.
Okay. So finger is said of all 5, right? Now you might say, I have what? 4 fingers and a thumb, right? Thumb gets the new name, right? Now, why does the thumb get the new name? And why do the other 4 keep the name finger? Is there something special about this finger that helped me to pick up this class? Huh? I guess they call it in biology the opposable thumb, right? Most people, the thumb sticks out sometimes, right? You want to get a ride, use the thumb, right? There's something special about this finger, right? So the other 4 keep the name finger, right? At least in daily speech they do, right? And this finger gets a new name, right? Okay. Now this is very close to univocal. So in one sense, a thumb is a finger. In another sense, it is what? Not. Okay. Take an example from us. Sometimes we say that man is an animal, right? The man and the beast, they're both animals, right? But sometimes we say that man is not an animal, right? So in some situations, to say you're an animal is no insult, right? That was doing a mimical in logic, saying you're an animal, right? Man is an animal. But in other circumstances, if I call you an animal, that would be insulting to say the least, right? So, animal is said of man and beast, but sometimes animal is kept by the beast as its own name, right? And man is given a new name, man, right? Okay? Because man is something noteworthy that separates it from the beast, namely reason, right? Okay? So though animal, in general, is said univocally of man and of what? The beast, right? Sometimes we oppose man and the animals, right? And so my mother would object when I was little if I called man an animal, right? Say, well, he's not just an animal, Mom. Well, okay, He didn't like the idea of calling man an animal, right? See? But you're thinking of animal then to mean really what? Beast, right? Okay? So there's some equivocation there, isn't there? Because in one sense, man is not an animal. He's not just an animal. But in some other sense, broader sense, he is an animal, right? Okay. So, this is one way this takes place then, huh? And, Monsignor Diane, when I talked to him about this, he would hesitate to even want to call this analogous, isn't it? Because it's so close to univocal, right? Okay. But I ran across a text one time in Thomas where he's saying, the objection was saying, you don't distinguish the genus against the species. You would distinguish between square and quadrilateral, right? It's a different thing. But sometimes you do, if in terms of the meaning, right? Okay. So it seems there is some distinction, however a little, right, in meaning between animal as said of man and animals opposed to man, right? Okay. So it's kept, in this case, by the one that adds nothing noteworthy, let's say, to the common meaning, right? And the one that adds something noteworthy or that stands out gets a new what? Name, right? Okay. And the one that adds something that stands out gets the new name, huh? Gets a new name. Now we have an example of that in the categories. When Aristotle talks about disposition and habit, right? Sometimes he'll say that habit is a disposition. Other times he'll distinguish between habit and disposition. Well, a habit is a what? Firm disposition, right? A disposition not easily lost. So a habit adds to the idea of disposition in general, that it's something quasi-permanent, right? Something stable, right? So habit gets a new name, and a disposition that is easily lost keeps the common name, what? Disposition. Right? Okay. What we call mood often, right? You know how your mood changes very often during the day, right? For better or for worse. You see, well, mood is like a disposition, right? But it's easily lost, easily changed, right? Or you're being a just man or unjust man, or, courageous man or a coward, right? This is something more permanent, right? And easily lost, right? Okay. So you could divide disposition into disposition and habit. Well, obviously, disposition has a different meaning somewhat when it's said of disposition and habit, and when it's opposed to habit, huh? Okay. If you go to a nursery to buy a plant, right? They're thinking of something kind of small, right? And they might distinguish the trees from the plants, right? So that's in daily speech. It's not invented by us philosophers, right? You see? But in some sense, you'd see a tree as a plant, right? See? But at other time, you might distinguish the plant from the tree, right? So if you say, I want to buy a plant, they're not thinking of the tree probably when you walk in there and say that, right? So plant can be divided into plant and tree, right? A little like animal into animal and man. You see that? Okay. And, you find this kind of a commonplace in the parishes, They're talking about sex and so on. We've got to teach young men to look at the woman not as a thing, but as a person, right? So they distinguish between a thing and a person, right? I'm supposed to treat you like a person, not a thing, right? Okay. But is a person in some sense a thing? If they weren't a thing in some sense, it'd be nothing, right? Right? See? But very commonly we distinguish thing and person, don't we? So thing is divided into thing and person. In one sense, person is a thing. In another sense, a person is divided against a thing. But again, the person adds something of great dignity compared to the common notion of things, right? Reason and will and so on. Okay?
Can you read what you read up there? Okay.
Yeah.
Kept by the one that.
It's kept by the one that adds nothing noteworthy, right,
Okay.
to the common meaning. Huh? And the one that adds something that is noteworthy or that stands out will get the what? New name, maybe. Okay? Okay. Yeah. Sometimes, you'll find authors will say that the Iliad of Homer is a poem, right? And I forget how many lines they had, quite a few lines, right? But sometimes you would distinguish a poem from a what? Epic, right? And then the poem is something what? Kind of small and short, right? By the epic is what? So you're going to find this again and again in daily speech and being used everywhere, not just by the philosophers, right? And people are constantly being puzzled by that, right? But it's just a common equivocation. Huh? Okay. Now, the other way it takes place, is when the common name, and I'll have to give myself some more room here now, at least the second part of it. The other way it takes place is when only one of the two has fully or completely or perfectly the common meaning, and the other only in some imperfect way. And the one that has fully and perfectly and completely keeps the common name, right? And the one that has it only imperfectly is given a what? A new name, right? Huh? Okay? That's just quite different from this first case, huh? Sometimes it's kept by the one that has fully or perfectly the common meaning, when we say kept, I mean kept as its own, right? Kept as its own name. By the one that has fully or perfectly the common meaning, and the one that has imperfectly or effectively, if you wish, gets a new name as its own. Now, if you read the modern philosophers, you might find a famous work by John Locke called An Essay on Human Understanding, right? He's talking about human reason, right? So he calls it an understanding, right? Huh? Okay. Now, understanding can be said of our understanding and of the understanding of my guardian angel. And even of what? The divine understanding, right? And what does understanding in that sense mean? It means you have the ability to understand, right? Well, God and the angels are able to understand everything they naturally understand all at once. You don't have to think it out. You don't have to reason it out. You don't need any discourse, right? You don't have to think about things before they understand them. Understand right away. One time my son Mark was little at school. He says, "Why can't we be born with knowing everything we need to know?" I said, "You want to be born an angel?" I said, "That's the way I think to it." And the mind is full, right? Yeah? So everything they naturally know. Huh? So the angels or God, they keep the name what? Understanding. And man, who has a defective, imperfect, barely understands, and he has to think and think before he understands a little bit more, he's given a new name, and that is reason. See? So reason is defined as the ability for what? Discourse, right? For a large discourse, looking before and after, right? Huh? See? Why don't we define reason's ability to understand? Because in a way it is the ability to understand, right? But man doesn't understand very much, and he has to go through a discourse to understand the little bit he does come to understand. So, better to give him a new name, right? Because he has so perfectly, right? The ability to understand. Extremely weak, huh? So, in Latin, you'd have the word intellectus, right? Or understanding. And you could divide intellectus into intellectus, which is what the angels and God have, and ratio, which man has. In English, you can divide understanding into the understanding and reason, right? So sometimes you'll see that Thomas will say, our reason is an understanding, right? But sometimes he'll divide reason against understanding, huh? Meaning the power of understanding, huh? No, so that's a little different than the first case, isn't it? Huh? See, here, the one that keeps the common name is the one that has fully and perfectly and simply speaking, you might say, common meaning. The other one gets a new name, right? Okay. That's a very profound example, right? Giving you. But take a more familiar example here. Huh? Daddy, what's the difference between a kitten and a puppy? Well, I might say a kitten is a cat, right? A little cat. And a puppy is a little dog. Okay? So here I'm saying that a kitten is a cat and a puppy is a dog, right? Mm-hmm. But now sometimes we divide kitten against what? Cat, yeah. It's only a kitten, right? It's not yet a cat. So cat could be divided to cat and what? Kitten. Cat keeps the common name because he's fully developed, right? The kitten gets a new name, right? Okay. Just like if we said that a boy is a man and a girl is a what? Woman, right? You can say that. Okay? But sometimes, more often, we'll distinguish the man against the boy. To separate the men from the boys, as we say, right? then obviously, to separate the men from the boys are not men, right? Okay? And then we say of the girl, maybe she gets booed or something, say she's a woman now, right? Okay? So, that's an example, right? Of this, right? Because what distinguishes a man from a woman, only the adult has what? Fully, right? Okay. You see that? That's very important, huh? Aristotle sometimes calls the argument enthymeme, he calls that a syllogism. At other times, they call it rhetorical syllogism. And you call the argument called example, the argument from one singular to another singular of the same kind, you call that an induction. Rhetorical induction sometimes, right? At other times, he'll divide syllogism against enthymeme, right? An induction against what? Example, yeah. Sometimes he'll say, there's only two arguments, kinds of argument, syllogism and induction, right? And so enthymeme's got to be one of them, example the other. So enthymeme is a syllogism, example is an induction, I'll say, right? Okay. So, notice, syllogism is said of syllogism and enthymeme. Induction is said of what? Induction and example. Same kind of thing, right? And enthymeme is like an imperfect, incomplete syllogism, huh? It is something of the syllogism, but not fully or perfectly. And example has something of what an induction has, but imperfectly, right? See? So if we send, 100 people to this one restaurant, and we have 100 reports that they get a lousy meal, and so we conclude that, all meals at the restaurant are lousy. That's a kind of induction, right? See? But if I go to eat there once and have a lousy meal, and you're asking me what restaurant to go to, and I say, I won't go there, tell you my experience, I have something of induction there, don't I? I'm taking the one meal I had there as representative of meals at that restaurant now. So it's something like an induction going from the particulars to the general, but obviously it's very what?
Imperfect.
Very imperfect, yeah. See? So, simply speaking, without qualification, fully speaking, is not an induction, right? It's the argument called example. Example, by the way, is equivocal by reason, right? Example can mean a singular used to illustrate the universal, or it can mean an argument from one singular to another singular of the same kind. There's some connection between those two meanings, right? In both cases, you're using a singular to make known something in a way. So, most texts where Thomas talks about analogous names, he doesn't talk about these two, but he does talk about these two ways of speaking in other texts. Huh? So, and they are very common. They're very common in daily speech and in what? Philosophy, right? And in theology. Yeah. So that was a subdivision of the first way that a name becomes equivocal by reason. It seems to be said of two things sometimes, but then it's kept by one of them as its own name, right? And then the other one gets a new name, right? It almost seems, especially that first one, or the first of those two particular ways of doing it, almost like univocal, right? Okay. It's a little bit like, as we'll see later on when you compare the natures of things to numbers, right? It's like if you had what? 2 said of what? 2 and 2 plus 1. Well, this would keep the name 2, and 2 plus 1 would get a new name. 3. Okay? You notice 3 in a way has a 2 in it, but it's not just 2. And because it has something added to the 2, right? It gets a new name, right? And what is just 2 keeps the name 2, right? And what is an animal? An animal is a living body, a sensation. But man is something in addition to, right? He's more than that, as Shakespeare says, right? He has reason in addition to sensation, right? So what is just an animal, just a living body sensation, keeps the name animal, right? And the other one gets a new name. Okay? So you'll run across these about philosophy. Huh? Very common. Okay. Now, the other way that a name becomes equivocal is by being carried over. From one thing to another, huh? Now, perhaps there are two ways that this comes about. Sometimes it's carried over by being, as it were, generalized. Huh? Okay. In other words, by dropping part of its meaning, right? So you can apply it elsewhere, right? Huh? Okay. So, in a way, by dropping, part of its meaning. And the other way, you could say in general, is by ratios. Huh? Okay? The way it's carried over is by ratios. Okay. Now, the most famous example of this in philosophy is the word passio in Latin, or the Greek word, ave. And it's difficult to translate this in English. See, originally the sense of passion in Latin, or the Greek equivalent, is suffering. Okay? But the word suffering in English is stuck on its first meaning. Okay? Would you say, for example, that your understanding something is a form of suffering? Well, the word suffering doesn't seem to have been moved that way. It'd be speaking more metaphorically or accidentally. You said that, huh? Perhaps the best word in English to get something of the idea of this movement would be the word undergo. Okay? And see, suffering in its first meaning implies that you are being acted upon by something, right? And secondly, that you're being changed, right? By being acted upon, right? But most of all, you're being changed to the worse, right? So the passion of our Lord, right? The suffering of our Lord. Huh? Okay? You're being acted upon something that is changing you for the worse, right? Okay? Now, the English word to undergo probably has originally a bad sense, right? If we say about somebody, he's undergone a lot, what is that probably taken at?
Negative.
Yeah. He's under the weather. See, the weather, the air, and so on, has acted upon him, right, in a way that has changed him, right, for the worse, right? Okay. He's undergone a lot, huh? Had a rough life. Okay? He has almost that sense of suffering, right? Now, you could drop the idea of being changed for the worst, right? And just say that you are acted upon and changed, but not for the worse. So if I have a piece of clay here, let's say in the shape of a sphere, and I mold it into a cube, it's undergoing something, right? It's being acted upon, and it's being what? Changed, right? But you wouldn't say for the worse. It's not a real suffering, is it? Okay? Then Aristotle says that what is sensing? Seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting. Well, when you study the various abilities of the soul, the various abilities of an animal or a plant or man, we distinguish these abilities by their acts. Okay? So we distinguish, let's say, the ability to hear and the ability to see by hearing and seeing, right? Okay. Well, we distinguish the acts by their what? Object, right? Because hearing and seeing are both sensing, but hearing is sensing sound and seeing is sensing color. So sound and color distinguish hearing and seeing distinguish the eye and the ear, the ability, right? Okay. So ultimately distinguish the abilities of the powers by their object. Huh? But one very fundamental distinction is, does the object act upon the power, or does the power act upon the object? Huh? Well, now in the case of my digestive power, right, the power seems to act upon the object, and transform it. The object being food, right? And so I chew the food and acting upon it, and then they tell me all these digestive juices that are, attacking it and breaking it down and so on. Okay. But now in the case of seeing and hearing, is my eye acting upon color, my ear acting upon sound, or sound acting upon the ear, and color acting upon the eye? Which is it?
The latter.
Yeah. So, sensing then is a kind of what? Undergoing, right? Mm-hmm. It's a result of being acted upon, right? Okay. But is seeing or hearing a suffering? No. Is it really a change, or is it a fulfilling, a perfecting of the eye or the ear? It's really a perfecting of it, right? Notice how far the word has moved now, right? Okay. But still, because the senses are in a way a bodily organ, right? The eye and the ear and so on. The object can, if it's too bright or too loud, can actually what? Harm the body, right? Okay. But then finally we come to the reason itself. And is reason originally acting upon its object, or is it object acting upon it?
Object acting upon.
Yeah. But here you're altogether free of that idea of suffering at all, because to use a famous comparison there in the Dhyana, if you hear something very loud, you're kind of deaf for a while afterwards, right? At least temporarily. See something very bright, blinded, But if you understand something very understandable, other things are not less understandable, but more so. So it doesn't seem to be at all any kind of suffering there, right? But still, you're being what? Acted upon, undergoing. So the word undergoing, they say in its original meaning, it involves being acted upon, changed, right? To the words, right? And then you start to move it by dropping out the idea for the words to just say you're being changed. And finally, we even drop the idea of change. Because strictly speaking, seeing and hearing is not so much being changed, but it's being fulfilled, right? See? And then see what coming to understand is not being changed so much, it's being fulfilled, perfected, right? So it's moved from a meaning where it's really something bad to something that is not only good, free of bad, but it is being perfected, becoming good, right? Okay. Best thing I ever seen in Gabriel Marcel, which is this little passage here where he's criticizing Jean-Paul Sartre, right? And Sartre is saying anything acted upon is bad, right? Because the other is imposing itself upon him. Because Marcel points out that destroys friendship and any kind of real, the teacher, the student, any kind of thing like this, right? But how your friend, acts upon you in many ways, right? And your mother and father did, and so on, right? The teacher does, and so on. So but for him, all being acted upon, right, is bad. It's what's the famous word in law Pharisee? It's ultra, right? Hell is the others. In other words, he's stuck on that first meaning, that all undergoing is suffering. I was quoting that teacher, right, a friend of my brother Richard's, saying, that's a tap on the twins, and they say, why are you doing this to me, right? And sometimes it seems that way to us, right? Why are you inflicting this upon me, right? And sometimes, the kid will see, if he's made to read some good literature or something like that, he's got to read Shakespeare or something, or he's got a music appreciation class, he's got to listen to some, and he kind of resents this, or finds this, But the point is, there's a reason why the first meaning of undergo is something bad, right? Because it's more sensible, and that's where our knowledge begins with the senses, If I was to stick a pin in you, you'd be more aware of the fact that I'm acting upon you than I am, when you see me, I'm acting upon your eyes, and I'm acting upon your ears. You don't really think about that very much, so do you? Because it's pleasant to see and hear, right? Huh? And so you're not painful, right? Huh? But if I was shining a bright light in your face that's actually hurting your eyes, or I was shouting in your ear, with a bang, bang sound that's really kind of hurting the ears, right? Then you'd be very much aware of the fact that you're being acted upon, right? Because of the contrariety to your nature. Get that pin or that knife and sticking in your ribs, right? You're very much aware of the fact that I'm acting upon you. So that's why that's the first meeting, right? We name things as we know them, right? And this is very sensible, right? It's very clear that this is acting upon that. And it's contrary to the nature of the thing being acted upon, right? And actually destructive or on the way to destroying it, huh? You see? And notice that even like in the weather, you take talk about being under the weather and so on, but sometimes if it's if we're too hot in the room or it's too cold, or then people will talk about it, right? Huh? It's cold in here, or it's hot in here, it's this. But then if it's too cold for your body or too hot for your body, you're being acted upon in a way that is contrary to the good of your body, right? Comfort of your body, and you're more aware of it, right? Okay. But notice how you're dropping part of the meaning, right? So that's the most famous example of this, huh? Okay. But sometimes take the word genus, right? The word genus there, as we define it, is a name said with one meaning, right? Of many things, right? Other than kind, signifying what it is. And difference was also a name said with one meaning and so on. But sometimes you'll see that even Aristotle or Plato or Thomas will use the word genus or difference for a name that's said maybe equivocally by reason, right? Of many things, right? And yet it's kind of like a genus, right? And they'll call it something as a genus, right? Okay? Well, it seems to be this kind of equivocation, right? Huh? It has something of the meaning there of genus, right? Okay? But not every part, huh? Okay. We saw a little bit of the word property there, right? Huh? A property in the full or perfect sense there, right? Is a name of something following upon what? Nature, right? Huh? But it's a name of what belongs to only one species, to every member and always, right? Like half of 4 is a property of 2, right? Only 2 is half of 4. Every 2 is half of 4. Always 2 is half of 4, right? But then we could call less than 10 a property of 2 too. Why? Every 2 is less than 10. 2 is always less than 10. But you dropped out now, what? Only, right? Okay. So someone might say that half of 4 is a property in a different sense of 2 than less than what? 10, right? But is it purely by chance that we call less than 10 also a property? No. But we've dropped part of the meaning of the word, right? Okay? Maybe I have some as an example here, right? Again, the example is giving me a genus, right? We drop the idea of univocal, right? Okay. Like when I was if I define seeing, if I define looking, right, as trying to see, right? Well, to see there is a part of the definition now, but is it really univocal there? See? Well, to see can mean what? the act of the eye, or imagining, or understanding, right? And looking has two meanings, right? So sometimes we'll define something. In a way, we have two definitions there, right? But another way, we have one definition because we can state it in one word. But the words are not exactly like what we said. The Jesus and the difference, we have just one meaning, right? So that's one way that a name becomes equivalent. It's carried over, right? How do you carry it over to other things? Well, by dropping part of the meaning, right? In a sense, by generalizing it. There's a question there when you speak of let's say, Othello or King Lear as a tragedy, and then you speak of Macbeth or Richard III as a tragedy, right? See? Well, Othello and King Lear don't seem to knowingly choose evil, right? And so their downfall is really more pitiful, right? But, some people want to say that Macbeth is not a, tragedy, right? Because he knowingly chooses to kill the king and knowing it's bad, right? Huh? See? He's a monster. No, they don't want to say that, right? And for its glory, Richard III, I mean, the way he's portrayed in Shakespeare, right? It has something of the character of tragedy, right? It's a serious work. It's not purely maybe equivocally, but it loses some of that meaning, right? Maybe, when you call the Divine Comedy a comedy, right? Huh? Well, maybe comedy in the original sense is a likeness of the laughable, right? Huh? And a comedy, will go from misery towards happiness, right? Okay. Well, the Divine Comedy is not likeness of the laughable, right? But it has something of the comedy because it goes from the place of misery, inferno, to the place of happiness, paradiso. So it's not called a comedy purely by chance, is it? Okay. We have one letter down here. It explains why he calls it comedy. There's some scholar disputes to the authenticity of the letter, right? But certainly it's not a comedy in the original sense of the word. Most people, when they first see Divine Comedy, it kind of strikes them as odd, right? They shouldn't call it comedy. Very serious work, right? Maybe it's equivocal by reason in this way, right? Now, the other way is by ratios. Huh? Now, by ratio, we mean the order or relation of one thing to another, right? Okay. Now, perhaps there is at least 3 ways that this happens. Huh? One is by the ratio of the second to the first. Okay. Now, if you look at the Trinitati, for example, we distinguish between looking philosophy and practical philosophy, right? And logic is not really a part of looking philosophy, right? But it is the tool of looking philosophy, right? It's the tool for acquiring looking philosophy, right? The practical philosophy to some extent, So, if I call logic philosophy, not because it's philosophy in the original sense of the word, something pursued out of wonder, right? But because it's the tool of such knowledge, right? Then I'm calling it philosophy by its ratio to what is first called philosophy. You see that? Yeah.
What was the last sentence you just said?
Yeah. Logic is called philosophy, not because it's a knowledge pursued out of wonder, right? But because it's the tool for pursuing such knowledge, right? So if by philosophy you mean a knowledge pursued out of wonder, just to go back to the origin of philosophy, a knowledge that's for its own sake, right? Then logic is not philosophy in that sense at all. Okay? But logic is necessary for acquiring that knowledge. Huh? So it has a certain order or relation to that knowledge, right? What is the order or relation it has? It's a tool for that knowledge, right? A tool for acquiring that knowledge. So it's called philosophy in the second sense by a ratio, by relation it has, right? An order that it has to the what? First one. Okay? Now, Thomas gives an example of this on the Summa Conjunctives. He says, if being is said as substance and quantity, right? It's said first as substance, that's the fundamental thing. But it's said of quantity because it's the what? The measure of substance, the size of substance, right? It's something of substance, right? Okay? Take Aristotle's example there, the word healthy, right? If my body is healthy, that's the first meaning of healthy, right? The body is healthy, right? But now if the doctor says that your diet is healthy, what does that mean? Same thing? Yeah. Healthy is said of my diet because it preserves the health of my body, right? So it's not healthy in the same sense, is it? But it has a ratio or an order to the health of my body, right? Okay. He says my exercise is healthy, right? Or my complexion is healthy, right? Huh? My complexion is a sign of the health of my body, right? Okay. So that's one way that the word is said, right? Okay. Now, the second way is by other ratios to the same thing. By other ratios to the same thing. The example Thomas gives of this in Summa Conjunctives there, the same text. For the first example, he says, if being is said of quantity and quality, it doesn't mean the same thing. Not the different thing, huh? Being said of quantity and quality. But it's not purely by chance, huh? Because quantity is the measure of substance, and quality is, as it were, the disposition of substance. So they have other ratios to the same thing, right? So there's a reason why they're both called being, right? Okay? By other ratios to the same thing. Now there's one more way by which a name can become equivocal by reason of ratios. And that is by like ratios to other things. By like ratios to other things. An example of that was the word before, right? If you take, the second meaning there, say, of before, which is before and being, right? And then the third meaning of before, which is before in the discourse of reason, or more generally, before in our knowledge, right? Huh? Well, you could say that just as this can be without that, but not vice versa, so this can be known without that, but not vice versa, right? So there's four terms there, right? Huh? But there's a what? A likeness of ratios, right? Huh? To other things, right? Huh? Okay. Now, the two other situations you could have with ratios would be for things to have the same ratio to the same thing, right? Okay. But in that case, it would seem to be what? Univocal, yeah. So I have two sons, Paul and Marcus, right? And they both have the same ratio to me. Paul is a son of me. Marcus is a son of me, right? So when the word son is said of Paul and Marcus, I would say that's univocal, right? Okay. The other one would be to have other ratios to other things, right? And that would seem to be no basis for equivocal by reason, right? See? They have nothing in common, right? They have other ratios to what? Other things. Huh? Okay. So Paul is my son, and 2 is half of 4. I don't see that. I'm not 4. And to be half of something and to be a son, I don't think that's like ratios, is it? Huh? That's it? Okay. So you can make a box, but those two, one would be too much alike to be univocal, and the other would be, nothing in common, right? So you have these two ones here, where you have two ratios, right? But either other ratios to the same thing, so Aristotle's famous example is that of, in the 4th book of Metaphysics, is that of healthy, right? Huh? Many things are called healthy, but by other ratios to health, right? So my complexion is called healthy because it's a sign of health, right? My diet or exercise is called healthy because it preserves or restores my health, right? Okay? And then by like ratios to other things. And this is what the Greek word analogy originally meant. See? And now you see, in Euclid, he uses the word proportion for a likeness of ratios. Okay? But then people begin to call a ratio a proportion, right? I notice the scientists can say this is proportional, that means a ratio. So proportion has now come to have two meanings, and that is unfortunate in some ways, right? Proportion can mean both a ratio and a what? Likeness of ratios. Huh? But originally the word, logos in Greek means ratio, and analogos means what? This likeness of ratios. Huh? So I think it's kind of unfortunate language there, because when proportion means ratio, then you have to, like proportionality, meaning a likeness of ratios, but it's not as good, huh? It'd be better to keep the word ratio to mean the order relation of one thing to another, and proportion a likeness of ratios. So proportion has 4 terms, right? So when they call naming equivocal by reason, analogous naming, right? Huh? They're naming it from one what? Part of a part of a part of, in a sense, right? And Aristotle uses the word analogous right for this thing down here, see? And what's his name? Euclid does the same thing, right? Okay. So I think you sometimes get a more narrow understanding of what name equivocal by reason is. Huh? I mean, it goes all. This is the most interesting in some ways. it goes all the way back to that first one we talked about, which is almost like univocal, right? Once you get beyond it, we want to admit that as being equivocal, but in some way it seems to be, right? Because in some sense you can say, I'm an animal, and in a sense I'm not an animal, right? There's got to be some equivocation there, it seems, but it's very close to univocal, right? But this here is so far away, it's sometimes hard to tell this apart from what we call metaphor, right? If you go to a philosophical conference now, people don't understand very much. They often call this metaphor, and they can't make the distinction between the two, right? It's hard to. A good example here of this is if you take the word to see and the word I, right? When we use the word to see, to imagine, and even to understand, I think this is equivocal by reason, right? So likeness of ratios, But I think when, let's say Gregory the Great says that anger disturbs the eye of the soul, I think that's what? More like a metaphor, But sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two, right? But seeing is a more material sort of thing, right? And more lends itself to coming to mean to understand, right? Why I is the physical structure, and that's in no way like reason, which is not bodily at all. Okay. So the things it's hard to tell them apart, right? See? Because here you're stretching it, see? And the word metaphor itself is a Greek word for what? Carried over. One thing is kind of curious, if you look at the Greek word and the Latin word for carried over, we take it both of them in English, metaphor and translation. See, latio and fora mean what? Carried. And meta, over, right? Trans, over. See? So Thomas will talk about, the translatio nominis, the carrying over of a name, right? Okay. But notice what's happened in English, right? Metaphor in English and translation, there's no reason why they had to be done this, but translation, you're not carrying over the name, you're carrying over the what? The meaning, yeah. Metaphor, you're carrying over the name, but not the meaning. I mean, etymologically speaking, they're exactly the same, right? Okay. But if the meaning gets very distant, carrying a tremendous distance, then we start to speak of a metaphor, right? Rather than a name equivocal by reason. Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so dormants hasten to their end. That's a beautiful proportion there, right, that Shakespeare has on the metaphor simile. I don't think we'd start calling it minutes, waves, would we? Got 5 waves and I gotta go. You ran a mile in 6 ways. No. See? The likeness is just too distant, right? Okay. And in theology, Thomas asked, should sacred scripture use metaphors, right? And of course, one of the objections is, he always objects to himself, right? One of the objections is that to use metaphors is appropriate to the poet, right? Which is the lowest as far as the mind is concerned for the parts, right? And why should the highest use the what? The lowest, right? And Thomas's answer, if you've seen the text there, right? He says, well, in a way it's for the same reason that theology uses it, the poet does, but in other ways for exactly the reverse reason, In the case of the poet, he's trying to take something that in itself is not understandable, and he's trying to bring it up and make it more understandable than it really is. The scripture is trying to take something that's above our mind, very understandable, but above our mind, and trying to what? Bring it down to our mind, right? So what's common to the use of metaphor in scripture and in fiction or in poetry is that it's something that's not proportioned to our mind, right? But the reason why it's not proportioned to our mind is in one case because it's below our mind. In another case, it's too bright for our mind. It's too understandable, you know. So in a sense, it's just the reverse, right? And so, you know, you can see that something like Dante's Divine Comedy is not really what's characteristic of fiction. He's trying to take something that's above us, right, like in the Paradiso, right, and bring it down, right, to our level, the way Scripture does the metaphor, right? You know, notice this common metaphor for the Beatific Vision. That's a banquet, right? You see that a lot in the Psalms and other places. And Christ says, you know, you're going to eat at my Father's table, right? Same thing I eat. That's speaking metaphorically, right? And notice how in daily life we'll speak that that's food for thought, right? Something it's an object to think about, something to think about, right? So food is the object that we first talk about in the soul, right? Talk about the plant power, and its object is food, right? And metaphorically we call the object of what? The mind, food for thought, right? The Beatific Vision is called what? A banquet, And so the banquet has everything, right? You know, it's like the phase that they have, you know, where you have so much variety, you know, that you can't do justice to it, Well, in a sense, this is the way, you know, the Brahman is even spoken of, right? Only inflectamentum, siamentum. So, but those are what? Something that's above our mind, trying to bring it down to our level, right? So, when Shakespeare says, like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten therein, he's giving the waves, he's giving the minutes of our time more existence than they have. Because if you're down by the ocean and watching the waves come in, there's not only the wave that's crashing against the shore, but there's maybe 2 or 3 other waves you can see. Hey, there's a big one coming, you know? You're getting ready for it. And they already exist, some of the other ways, right? But the next 2 or 3 minutes don't exist yet. See? So you're giving these things more being than they have. See? Like God is I am who am, right? You know? He has more being, more reality. So you're bringing it down. So in a sense you're doing just the contrary thing, right? Now you compare, as I say, the Divine Comedy, say, with the Iliad, right? The original of the Iliad might have been a pirate raid, you know, on the coast of Asia Minor, right? When Homer gets through with it, it'd say, what? It's an image of human life, right? You know? It's tremendous what he does, So he's giving something maybe insignificant, right? Great significance, you know? He's giving it more meaning. And this is what the great poet does, You know? And it's like, you know, what a great portrait painter does, right? The portrait painter, if you get, you know, Titian is probably the master, right? And Titian tries to capture the whole character of a man in one expression in that painting, right? And you know in real life how most people don't like photographs, you know, of themselves, right? You know, and you get your photograph on the license and so on. Doesn't look, you know. But no one expression of this. Your friend's face captures his or her whole what? Character, right? In other words, it doesn't have that much meaning. You know? And you kind of need many expressions of that person, right? You kind of an idea, you know, the way they laugh, the way they react to different things said and different things that happen, right? And you start to, you know, see their character, right, in these different expressions. But no one expression captures the whole of what this person means to you, right? But the portrait painter seems to be doing that, right? With one, you know, see? There's a kind of a concentration there. So you're giving more meaning, right? These things really have, I was reading Father Philip Hughes there, you know, the church historian, right? We're reading his little popular history of the Reformation, very, very well written. But he's talking about how the historian tries to, you know, speak in a somewhat orderly way, you know, about the events, right? But, you know, you've got to be warned that they didn't really, at the time, see the significance of these events, right? He's talking about this this interim thing there in 1955 in Germany, you know. This would be the end of the Reformation now. It's really established then, you know. But they didn't know it at the time, right? The historian sees this is the end of this age almost, and another age is beginning, right? You know? And so in a sense, he's seeing an order that the characters themselves didn't. I mean, when the poet puts the events, you know, in a plot with the beginning, middle, and end, is that the way our life is? No, we don't see it anyway. It's kind of a chopped up thing, right? Things that have no connection, right? You know, are juxtaposed, right? Huh? But the poet, he puts the events together, right? So it forms a beginning, middle, and end. You know? So he's giving things an order and intelligibility they don't really have. Right? And one thing that strikes us, you know, too, people have often said this, you know, with Shakespeare, that these characters in Shakespeare, like Hamlet and King Lear and all these other characters, they're much more sharply drawn in our memory and imagination than people we've known in daily life, right? You know, King Lear and Hamlet are much more different to me than you two guys are. You know what I mean? In other words, there's a kind of an intelligibility about these characters that there aren't about people in daily life, and then, you know, we're more amorphous than Lear or Hamlet seems to be, right? So you're making these things more intelligible than they really are. But so that's really what's appropriate to these things. Huh? You know? In the same way, you know, if you get, you know, Mozart, who's the musician, right? He'll take, you know, the operas, these very commonplace, almost ridiculous situations, right? And he raises them up, you know, and all of a sudden they seem to be filled with meaning and mystery. You can't quite say what the meaning is, but I mean, they seem much more meaningful than any such thing, you know. It could be a domestic squabble, you know, and when it comes into music, you know, and it takes on this, you know. It's amazing what he does that, huh? But that's what the great painter, the great poet, the great musician does. They take things that are commonplace, right? And they break them up and they have much more meaning now than they really have in themselves. But Scripture is doing just the reverse, right? So, but the philosopher doesn't really use metaphor much, right? It's more to the theologian or the Scripture or to the poets, right? Or to the rhetorician. The rhetorician uses it less than the poet, but to some extent he uses these metaphors, other figures of speech. I had this one professor, you know, he was the head of the English department. He had all kinds of interesting things. And so they wanted him to give a talk on John Dewey, see? So he went over to the other college where they had a high opinion of John Dewey, and he gave a speech, a talk where he seemed to be praising John Dewey, right? Well, a day or so after he left, he realized that he had been tearing him apart, see? And you see this sometimes in the office, you know, someone would come in, you know, and ask about somebody, he starts out, and you think he's praising the guy, right? And of course, he's really taking him apart. Guy's kind of puzzled there, you know? You know? I mean, this is something very effective, right? You know? So rhetorically, it's very... Of course, in the case of this talking, you get the college, they're kind of getting mad at him now, you know, because... But name equivocal by reason, that's something that the philosopher is very much concerned with them. Especially in wisdom, you distinguish these words, right? But in logic, he does some, like the word before was taken from the categories, huh? Remember an article in National Review years ago. Stormy weather ahead, right? I could hear it out there, you know? Stormy weather ahead, right? That's a metaphor, right? Huh? See? Talking about troublesome period coming up in the country, right? Stormy weather ahead. But it appeals to the imagination, see? philosopher doesn't want to appeal to imagination, huh? There's something you mark, about the modern philosophers tend to give a example, that appeals to imagination, right? Why the Greek philosophers tend to use an example that makes the thing clear. Because they're using the example there to help you understand something. And the moderns, they tend to get carried away. Of course, the student would do that anyway, My old teacher, Pesuric, used to say, that he tells a joke to illustrate something, or, something. You'll remember the story, what it was, but not the point he's trying to illustrate. Right? But that's because our senses are kind of the singular, right? Notice our Lord's parables are kind of like a parable is like an extended metaphor, right? Expanded metaphor, right? But basically, it's like teaching by metaphor. Yeah. Many reasons for doing that, huh? Okay. So that concludes the first part of the art of definition about names, right? Okay, for the goodness of the teaching, we've talked a little bit about name equivocal by reason, huh? And when you get into the perihermeneutic of Aristotle, you have a good example of one of these equivocal ways of naming. I think I mentioned it before. When Aristotle divides a statement into noun and verb, right? Both of these are names as we define them, right? But in Greek and in Latin, you don't have a different word for name and for noun. In Latin, you have nomen, and for verb, you have a verbum, okay? In Greek, you have, I think it's rhema, and you have onoma, right? So here is onoma, right? Okay? Now, you read the great Ammonius Hermias, right? Who we think might have been a teacher at one time of Boethius, right? But Ammonius Hermias wrote this great commentary of the Perihermeneutic of Aristotle. And Thomas seems to have followed it very closely, right? Usually he disagrees with these guys, but to some extent it's subtle things, even Boethius. But he follows Ammonius very carefully, and even uses Ammonius' examples. Huh? And I guess the scholars say that where Thomas's commentary breaks off is where one of the medieval translations of Ammonius breaks off. Very interesting, right? But anyway, Ammonius is always explaining when he starts using the word onoma, whether he's using it in this sense as opposed to verbum, right, or as commendable, right? Because in one sense you can say the verb, the rhema is an onoma. In another sense, you divide against there, right? Okay. And in English, though, we can to some extent call this a noun and not a name, right? Although even in English there's a tendency to think of a name as being a noun, right? Or than a verb, right? Okay. We do have a separate word in English, huh? So we're a little richer there in that one sense, huh? Okay. But now, why is it that in Greek and in Latin there, why do you just keep the common name and just get a new name?
The verb seems to have something more.
Yeah. You see, both of them are a vocal sound, right, that signifies by human agreement. No part which signifies by itself, right? But the verb signifies with time. The noun signifies without time, right? Okay. So the verb adds something, right? Or the noun is negative, right? Doesn't seem to add anything to the common meaning, right? So this gets the new name, and this keeps the old name. That's an example from the logic of the second act of this kind of what?
Equivocal by reason.
Yeah. Very, very interesting example of that. Huh? Just like for the categories, they have the word disposition, right? Where disposition is divided sometimes into disposition and habit, huh? Okay, and this adds that, right? Huh? You find Aristotle sometimes in the philosophers distinguishing between doing and what? Making. Okay? And this is a very important distinction. Extremely important. And you'll see it used, it comes up in metaphysics, but it's in ethics, right? We'll say, for example, that there are two virtues of practical reason, foresight or prudence, and art. And art is right reason about making. Foresight or prudence is right reason about doing. So the distinction between doing and making is important for the distinction of the virtues there. But when you're making something, are you doing something? Yeah. So doing is divided into what? Doing and making, which sounds illogical. It would be if doing meant the same thing here, right? But why does making get the new name and this other doing just keep the name doing? Why? Yeah. In the case of making, there's a product in addition to whatever you're doing, right? See? So if I'm seeing you, there's nothing besides the seeing, right? But if I'm making a chair, apart from the making, at the end there's going to be a chair. When I'm no longer making, it's going to be a chair, right? Okay? So there's something, in addition, right? And this here, of course, is not something, doesn't make it more perfect. In fact, this would be more perfect activity than this here. But this here kind of stands out because it has that exterior product. Huh? So that's a very important example, you see.
With habit and the habit and disposition, is the thing added to firmness?
Yeah, the firmness, yeah. A habit is a firm disposition, but a disposition that is not firm just keeps the word disposition, right? And you'll dispose today, right? And what we call mood in English, it's a good example of disposition as opposed to habit.
Firmness is in the sense of constant?
What?
Firmness is in the sense of constant?
Yeah. It's stable. It's stable. Not easily lost, right? Whereas if I'm a just man today, I'm not going to easily become a thief today, right? Or if I'm a criminal and they put me in jail today, I'm not going to turn around tomorrow and be all of a sudden a just man, right? It's going to take some time if I change at all, right? But if I'm in this mood or that mood, today, how you say start of the day you're in the dumps or vice versa, right? And you change during the day, right? You change something quickly. Someone tells a joke and you laugh and kind of the moodiness is gone, right? So that's a disposition, right? Huh?
Yeah.
You see? So you see it in yourself and your friends and your family and so on. People are seeing changes, right? Used to have these, these cocktail hours, and they call them attitude readjustment. but the part about is changing a person's mood after being in the office for 8 hours and like that. He's also for his happy hour, or whatever it is, and now his mood has changed, right? So, but that's simply called disposition. So you got to find this as you go through, right? But so you get to the third act, you have the other one with the example of syllogism, right? Where syllogism is sometimes divided into syllogism and enthemy. And sometimes you call that thing the syllogism, sometimes you call it a rhetorical syllogism, right? But sometimes he'll distinguish between the syllogism and the enthemy. Right? The syllogism is like the boys to the man, right? It's something of the syllogism, but not the full. In the syllogism, you require complete universality in one of the premises, right? Universal affirmative, universal negative. the enthymeme is used more in rhetoric, in human action, where it's difficult to find things that are without exception, right? We can say, boys will be boys, right? That's what enthymeme would proceed from, things like that. But sometimes a boy acts like a man, right? You know? Sometimes, so there are exceptions. You know? So, it doesn't follow necessarily that if he's a boy, he's going to act like a boy. It's likely. Boys will be boys, see? But the enthymeme is from likelihood, and likelihood lacks that complete universality. You know? Politicians say what they do to get elected, right? Everybody thinks that, right? Okay. But Master Opinio, Natura Dictat, says Cicero, right? Okay. But is that true? Is there no exception to that? I was talking to a historian one time, and he said, "Who's that guy who said he'd rather be right than president?" And the historian says, "Probably some guy who didn't have a chance." I think some days you do have people, who do say the truth, right? You know, even though it's not going to get them elected, right? You know? So the enthymeme is based upon likelihood, which lacks the complete universality. Like no odd number is even, right? You know, every mother is a woman, right? So there's no exception, right? You need that complete universality for the syllogism. The enthymeme has something like that, right? Or some signs, and most signs are, more universal than what they're signifying. A guy staggering out of the bar, right? He's drunk, right? A man might stagger because he has a leg problem, right? Or he's old, or he's tired, right? But we jump like that, we still play on the bar, right? He's had too much, right? Take away his keys, don't let him drive, right? So not everybody who staggers out of a bar is drunk, right? Huh? My wife works with these brain injury people, and some of them seem like they're drunk, and sometimes a policeman will take that they're drunk, right, or something, but it's a little bit, So there are exceptions. So the enthymeme has something of the syllogism, but it falls short, so it gets its own name. The syllogism keeps a common name. Okay. In the same way we say in induction. How did the poet get his name? Does anybody know?
Maker?
Yeah.
Maker.
Well,
The poet means in Greek simply maker. Poiein is the common word to make. So among all those who make, he is called what? The maker, huh? Then Aristotle, when he speaks of Homer, he calls him the poet. So the double autonomy, huh? Now sometimes you have two of these figures of speech in one. I'll give you an example here. Suppose you turn the radio on to get you around here, or the TV to get the evening news, and the announcer says, the White House announced today that there will be da-da-da-da. How many figures of speech are there? The White House announced today.
At least two.
Yeah, what are the two figures of speech there?
There's the White House, the White House.
Yeah. It's Antonomasia. And then, was it the White House that announced, or was it the man in the White House that announced?
Metonym.
Yeah, metonymy, yeah. Yeah, it's a metonym, right? So White House there, among all the White Houses in the country, I live in a White House, by the way, but you say the White House, everybody understands the President's house. Huh? So that is the White House by antonomasia. But you say the White House announced today, then you mean the man, the spokesman, or whatever it is, right? The man in the house. So you're giving the name of the what? container for the contained. Huh? In a way, it's almost like this when I say I'm drinking a glass of water, right? You know, am I drinking a glass, or am I drinking what's contained in the glass? I'm drinking a cup of tea. What is the cup? Is it the tea, or is it the container that contains the tea that served me? It's like a tummy, isn't it? Huh? I drank a cup of tea. I drank a glass. Not literally, figuratively, but the figure of speech is the tummy. Huh? It's very natural to use these things. Huh?
Let this cup or chalice pass from me. Our Lord said, let this chalice pass.
Yeah. But in a sense, he says, this is my body, right? And then he says, in other words, a consecration for the...
This is the cup of my blood, or the chalice of my blood.
So, what else? I mean, to analyze what that is in terms of this, we have to see, there's two figures of speech there. Yet that's very common, huh? I think I read somewhere that the word pharaoh, I think, originally meant the palace, or what it was where the man lived, right? Huh? That's not unusual, right? We often refer to the Pentagon nowadays, right? You know, as a military matter. The Pentagon is working on this, right? Well, the Pentagon is really the building, isn't it? The men are not in the shape of a Pentagon, right? It's the building that's made in the shape of a Pentagon, right? You know? The Pentagon is the name of that building, right? But instead of saying, the men in the Pentagon, we say, the Pentagon is working on this now. Or the Pentagon recommends. You know?
The Vatican has decided.
Yeah. Rome has spoken, right? Case is closed. Right? Yeah. It's very common, huh? Now the Pope's message is called what? Urbi and Orbi, I guess, huh? It means to the city and to the world, right? But the city means what? Rome, yeah, it's called the city, right? When I was in Northern California, and I taught St. Mary's, people refer to San Francisco as the city, right? I taught the city. That's San Francisco, right? I mean, anything else? What else would it be, But I mean, that's antonomasia, right? It's not the only city, but it is the city, right? Okay. So, now, my card.